that. Okay, so we will now move to the presentation itself. If I can find share screen. Here we go. There, that's looking promising. I hope everybody can see that. Should be opening slide. It's a photo of Queenswood Country Park. Hopefully everybody's seeing it. Jolly good. Thanks, Francis. Just a bit of background here. It's a country park on Arboretum. It's a fair description, the green heart of Herefordshire. I spend a lot of time there, as do many of the people who are in this meeting. Visitors of all ages, that's certainly true. The background to most visits is the cries of children as they move around the site and enjoy the playground there. At the heart of the site is the Arboretum, but there's also a lot of semi-natural ancient woodland surrounding the Arboretum. And then with the new leaf involvement, we've got a hub for sustainable development, and it's also very much a centre for wildlife conservation within Herefordshire. It was once run by Herefordshire Council, Herefordshire County Council, in previous manifestations, and in one stage Hereford and Worcester County Council. We go right back. It's publicly owned, but it's leased on this 99-year lease as a community asset transfer from the council to Herefordshire Wildlife Trust and New Leaf. This was the start of the coppicing at Queenswood. It was an email from Paul Ratcliffe, who is the reserves officer for Queenswood. He did at one stage work at the site when it was operated by the council. He's been there a long time. And back in 2018, almost just under 2 years ago, he sent out this email with this enticing headline, which certainly enticed several of us to respond in the affirmative, saying that we'd like to take part. 2 trainees to get a basic chainsaw certificate. One of them was Glyn, who's part of the Briddy Green Dingle volunteer group, and another was Ellie Baggett, who was a volunteer assistant reserves officer at the time. They got their chainsaw certificates, and Kevin Ryan and myself signed up for this coppicing training, which was a week-long course on a range of different aspects of coppicing, which will become clearer as we go through the presentation. Originally, we thought we might get started on the 7th of January, but in the end, we started on the 28th. So it was early 2019 that the training course began. People involved, apologies to anyone I've missed out. I've tried to include everybody, but there were other people who moved in and out of the training programme and the coppicing that proceeded after it. Toby and Ali run a great company called Say It With Wood. Justin works for them. We've got their logo of the spade and the axe over on one side with the heart. Worth checking out. Those two have a great little video on their website explaining their company and what they do. And it's very well presented. Pete Boardman is a coppice worker, and he did a day's training with us on the details of coppice products in particular. Chris Hughes is the assessor with Moomac. He's based near Bilth Wells, and he is has a national profile in writing the various protocols for training and safety in forestry. and he assessed us in our tractor driving and chainsawing skills, tractor driving particularly. Paul, as I've said, is a reserves officer. He was very much involved with the training. And then volunteers, Paul Nifton is a volunteer, has been for 3 years or so. Every Monday, he's up at Queenswood doing various jobs helping Paul. And then there's me and Kevin, and then Ian James, who's still working in a paid capacity with the Trust. I believe he's on his way to Leeds at the moment. But he was a volunteer assistant reserves officer, and he helped a lot last winter with the coppicing. And also, during the year that we started, Rose Farrington was the Queenswood Heritage Gateway officer. The Queenswood Heritage Gateway project, this is one of their logos here. And I'll say a little bit about that project because it does have a lot of relevance to coppicing at Queenswood. That's the end of the introduction. I will go into the theory of coppicing. Are there any questions so far? Anne have come up on the introduction on the chat.
No, nothing so far.
Okay, we will move on. As well as being a country park with many visitors, it is a working woodland. As I've said, the Arboretum is the bit at the top, but there is a lot of work going on in the woods around. A few little bits of background that are in the little booklet that Rose's project produced, called Our Wood on the Hill, available from the shop at Queenswood. The UK is one of the least wooded countries in Europe. I mean, it would once have been almost covered in woodland. There would have been patches that weren't woodland, but post-Ice Age, there would have been far, far more woodland than there is now across all of Europe. And the UK has removed more than many other European countries. The woodlands on the hillside designated as a site of special scientific interest, henceforth referred to as a triple SI. And they are managed, 10-year Forestry Commission approved management plan with funding from the Countryside Stewardship Scheme. As I say, all that information is in the booklet. Why do we manage woodlands? This is James Hitchcock quoted in that little booklet. He is the estate's senior manager in the Wildlife Trust, and he sets it out clearly here. It's vital to manage your woodland. As he says at the bottom there, unmanaged woodlands, and 42% of the limited amount of woodland in the UK is unmanaged, supports far less wildlife. So managing the woodland is good for the wildlife, the biodiversity and the numbers of each living thing that's there in the wood. It's partly because management creates diversity in age and species. You get open spaces with grasses, wildflowers, insects that feed on them, and then that works right the way up the food chain, and you get a greater biodiversity in managed woodland. And it's also much better from the point of view of floodwater retention and rainwater retention. So the very topical issue of flood control, natural flood control, is something that those in charge of flood management are very interested in, and actively managed woodland can play a big role in controlling the speed at which water, floodwater, rainwater runs off the hills into the rivers, and can therefore help control flooding. It's about 13 acres are managed as coppice. It's below the viewpoint, and if you're on the viewpoint, it's generally off on your right, the area that is managed, although some of it is directly below the viewpoint as well. But the bulk of it is off to the right. Cut in small areas, a 10 or 20 year rotation. The meaning of that will become a little more apparent later on, this word rotation. But it means basically the trees are cut in each compartment every 10 to 20 years. And they grow vigorously from a root system, which might be hundreds of years old. Certain species will benefit from that. For example, hazel. The trees will live for a lot longer because they're being coppiced. There's a variation of this method, which is traditional through much of Herefordshire, coppice with standards. And what you do there is you keep a few of the best specimens to mature. You don't cut them down to ground level to regrow as coppice stools. I'll have photographs of these various terms a bit later on. But we believe that most of our woodlands would be managed in this way. And the materials, the range of materials are enormous. Hot poles, fences, building materials, firewood, bark was produced for tannin. And if I can read a quote from chapter 4 of the excellent Landscape Origins of the Wye Valley, a book which came out of a project. David Lovelace and Heather Hurley were two of the people involved in it. There were many others. David Lovelace, in his chapter on woodland, referring to the coppice with standards system, says, local people also needed wood for their domestic fuel requirements. This is in addition to the whole list of things that are given before this point in the text. So all the small branch wood and very young coppice was bundled into faggots. Not a twig was wasted. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind. Today, 21st century, we try not to waste anything and make use of pretty much everything, as hopefully you will see. But this is a traditional thing. The sunny, scrubby, flower-rich areas, different habitats, an important number of species, including warblers, dormice, and butterflies. David Lovelace did a survey for butterfly conservation, and one of the conclusions of that survey was that coppicing would be a very good thing for butterflies, among many other things. This is the science. This is probably the most complicated slide of the lot. It was once part of A-level geography. It was certainly part of my degree as a geographer. There we go. There is a concept called plant succession, plant colonisation, or a SERE, S-E-R-E, which is the idea that if you have a piece of bare land, even if it's a volcanic lava flow that's just cooled, it will be colonised by plants. And they move in a succession. There is a concept of residential succession, which is the kind of movers and shakers move in first, the creatives, and then the big money moves in and the gentrification takes place. And this has been applied to places like Notting Hill and London Docklands and whatever. Plants have been doing the same thing much longer than humans. And the early colonisers are the ones that can tolerate the harsh conditions of, for example, a lava flow or a heap of sand and sand dune. And they alter the conditions to make way for later communities to move into the slightly improved conditions that have been left by the preceding one. So you gradually move up in your productivity as you move through the succession. That's the right-hand graph there. Gross production increases, but it reaches a peak and starts to tail off. Now, the reason plants are producing biomass is that they need it themselves for respiration. So if you look at the, I have to move this so I can see on my own screen. There we go. The respiration is the dashed line there on the right-hand graph, and the gap between them is called the net primary productivity. And that is what is left over of the growth after the plants have consumed what they need themselves. And you can see that that reaches a peak at a fairly early stage in the plant succession. So this graph here with the red line is hooked out of this one on the right to show that productivity, net productivity, the excess of gross primary productivity over respiration, is at a peak in the early cereal stages. Now, that early cereal stage, the kind of part way point to a climatic climax, is often called a subclimax if it is natural. A subclimax can be produced by waterlogging, for example, or strong winds, which will all forever prevent, as long as they remain in place, prevent the climax community of high forest, or in the case of the Amazonas tropical rainforest, it will prevent that being reached. And so if it's maintained by human activity, it's not called a subclimax, it's called a plagioclimax. And that is what we've got with, for example, heather moorland, which is maintained at a fairly early stage in the moorland succession by burning, by people. Coppicing is a human activity that produces a plagioclimax in a site that would otherwise progress to full woodland cover of mature trees. And as such, you are maintaining a very strong net primary productivity. This, as I hope some people, scientists are realizing, if you don't already know it, would tend to indicate that you've got quite a lot of photosynthesis and removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the plant growth. Now, it does get very complicated, and there are arguments among scientists about the benefits of woodland management, for instance, for firewood, as to whether or not this is carbon neutral or even carbon negative. But these graphs here are widely accepted and widely taught in A-level and university courses on ecology. But if you haven't understood all of that, just take it from me that there is widespread agreement that there are great benefits to the natural world, to wildlife, to maintaining these plagioclimax before things progress to the full climax community, where respiration is equal to production. The ecosystem has achieved a balance, but it's not as productive as it is at the plagioclimax. There may be errors in the science there, for which I apologise. I'm probably not going to be able to pick up detailed questions on that. By all means, I can point you to some other information if you contact me through the trust afterwards. That's the end of the theory. Have we got any questions come up on that, Anne?
No, not yet. Not that I can see. No.
No. Okay. Where? Okay, we get some mapping coming in here. This is a Bearwood Associates Limited, who are a forestry consultant. They produced this map of the compartments. You can see the lookout area is just up there. So if you're standing looking out across Herefordshire, then some of the coppice compartments are over here on your left, but the majority are over here on your right as you look out from that viewpoint. They lie to the west of the viewpoint. There are over 20 compartments, I think it works out at. And as I said earlier, it's 13 acres altogether that are coppiced. And this shows each compartment with a letter attached to it. They're various sizes. Most of the ground is sloping down towards the south. I'll show you a contour map later on. These two compartments, M and S, were cut in early 2019. D and F are ones that were cut early in 2020, before lockdown, before March. And compartment H is being worked on at this very moment. Well, not in the dark tonight, but Kevin and I were there on Monday with Paul, and rather more of us, I think, will be back there next Monday. We're working just in this area here. So if you visit Queenswood, you can almost see where we're working from the viewpoint. You might need to walk along this track to the top of it to see that. This is a wonderful piece of open source software to which David Lovelace very kindly introduced me and tutored me. He has a lot of tutorials on using it online. If you're interested at all in mapping and building your own maps, QGIS is wonderful, absolutely brilliant. I was able to transfer those compartments onto a base map there, which is a large-scale ordnance survey map, and they are basically a layer resting on top of the ordnance survey map. At the moment on this layers panel here, there are 4 layers, 2 of which are ticked, which means you can see 2 of them. The compartments in pale green, overlaid on the Ordnance Survey large-scale map of Queenswood. And I've put stars on the 2 compartments from 2019, the 2 from early 2020, and this one here from late 2020. I also tried putting it onto a geo-referenced air photograph to see how it compared. The trouble is the photograph is quite an old air photograph, but it does pick out clearly this compartment, which had just been cut at the time that the photograph was taken, and this compartment here. I've segued into calling these things compartments without explaining that. If we treat the whole thing as the coppiced area of 13 acres, that is divided into smaller parts, which are sometimes called coupes, from the French word cut, or compartments, which are the areas that are cut down to the ground, leaving a few standard trees. And you can see that very clearly in the underlying air photograph there. That compartment had been freshly cut when the photograph was taken. This was a really interesting exercise. This shows what's called LiDAR, which, to be very quick about it, is micro contouring. It shows the terrain, the surface. You can remove the trees and buildings and get right down to the kind of what many in the government are calling granular level of the very fine detail of the ground surface. So for instance, here, curving round underneath the layers panel and back out again is the old road up Queenswood. This is the new road, the A49, going up the side there with the big cutting on its left-hand side as you go up. This is the small road going down towards the railway inn after the nasty right turn somewhere down here. But this is the old road, and I've been into this compartment here to try and find it, and I found it very difficult, whereas the LiDAR picks it up beautifully as this shallow trough. And all over Queenswood, on these lower slopes, there are these gullies and lines which are old routeways, possibly used for dragging logs with horses. So they've been scoured out over the years, possibly even old drovers' roads. Almost certainly that's what this one would have been. And then just sort of embankments and ditches, which, if you read Oliver Rackham on his book on woodlands, are a very important part of the woodland landscape of the UK. And there's even faintly visible little gullies here, which are barely a metre deep. But LiDAR will pick up things as detailed as 25 centimetre interval or less. So that was very helpful in redrawing some of the coppice compartment boundaries to get them as accurate as possible, helping to estimate their size, etc. LiDAR, if you've not discovered it, there's absolutely weeks of amusement and great interest and research value, and it's open source as well. There's the more familiar Ordnance Survey map. That is a whole grid square on the Ordnance Survey map, so that's a 1 kilometre square. These are the compartments faintly visible here. This is the viewpoint, and you can see that the ground slopes steeply in all directions away from the northernmost compartments. And some of the ground over here is really quite steep. One of the compartments we were working in early 2019 was over in that area. But nearly everything is sloping to the south. Any questions on the where?
Yeah, well, there's a comment.
Yep.
From Jim Hardy to everyone. If people haven't read it, it says, before large herbivores were excluded from woods, they did the same job as coppicing, so presumably maintained the maximum production of biomass. Climax temperate forest is a man-made situation.
By removing those herbivores.
So.
Okay. Yep. Point taken. Whether there would have been enough of them to completely control it, I don't know. I go with Jim and whatever David Lovelace would say on that. But it's an interesting point, and it would have been, if it was the herbivores, that would have classified as a subclimax, I think, rather than a plagioclimax. Plagioclimax is a term reserved for human activity. This is just a little bit about when. This is a spreadsheet that Paul has produced. They're numbered 7 rather than 1, but D and F are the compartments cut in early 2020. So you can see that, late 2019, early 2020. So back in December, at the end of the year 2018, they were 19 years old. We then cut them in early 2019, which means that by the end of that year, we were cutting them in late 2019, which means that they go back to 0 in terms of their age. So at the end of this year, those 2 compartments, D and F, will be 1 year old. Quite a complicated spreadsheet. This is just one section of it. Obviously, it scrolls down to show the others if it was live. But that's the kind of detail that has been prepared for the coppice rotation. And this is an example of a compartment that was cut because it had reached the maximum age that we would want the compartments. There are different rotation cycles. You can have very short rotation coppice with things like willow, for example. And if anyone's interested, there is such a compartment, I think, as you cross the River Team coming out of Bransford towards Hereford. I think it's webs of witchbold growing willow there, but it seems to be on some kind of rotation on the right-hand side of the road as you climb up out of Bransford. That is really very short rotation, whereas the kind of trees that we're dealing with at Queenswood have a longer rotation of up to 20 years. What it means, if I go back quickly to the compartment map, and you can see D and F there, which were cut in late 2019, early 2020, is that all these compartments, each one is a slightly different age, or sometimes you get 2 which are the same age. But altogether, it makes up a mosaic of different ages of coppice and therefore different stages of growth of the trees and different light conditions which favour different organisms. So it's the mosaic effect that creates the biodiversity. Any questions on when?
No, there was just one other comment that was made by Richie Cottrell, which was, I think, referring to a name that they have in Radnorshire for compartments, which is, and it's going to be my weird accent, a cant, C-A-N-T.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, yeah. And there will be other local names as well. Robert McFarlane's book on names has quite a lot of those for various countryside features. Okay, a cant, right. Thank you, Richie. David Lovelace is the source of this photograph, which he would have got out of the archives. I counted 11 men and I think 6 horses. Uttering the word men, I instantly think I must point out that the woodland management during the First World War was done largely by women, including, I think, Alfred Watkins' daughter, who's in some of the photographs in that booklet and certainly on the interpretation panels up at Queenswood. But that photograph was pre-First World War, and they are producing hop poles, just one of the many products that come out of coppiced woodland. And you can see there that these would not be for the dwarf hops that are widely popular now. These are quite substantial hop poles of ash, and a big team of people working there to produce that. This engraving, 1835, it's not Herefordshire, but it was going on in Herefordshire, and it shows women largely stripping the bark from a felled oak tree there. And as we know from earlier on in this slideshow, bark was used for its tannin, which was an important part of the tanning process, oak bark in particular. Now, while researching this, I found this wonderful painting, David Bates. He's part of a school of painting that included Benjamin Leader, who did a painting called February Fildyke, which is quite a well-known painting, very characteristic of that time of year. When I looked up this artist, I found out that he did work in our area, and I couldn't find any proof that this painting was from Herefordshire or Worcestershire. But what's going on here is the bark that has been stripped off the trees has been stacked up in what's called a fence here to begin to dry. And my guess is that this person here is setting up a rail on which to stack more bark, which is being brought across here. The stripped trees are in the background. There's a hint as to how the trees were felled at that time. And I like this here because this is the pile of faggots. You know, not a twig was wasted, to quote David Lovelace again, already there for fuel for the poorer people of the parish. And I've got a fanciful idea that, to me, is absolutely characteristic of May Hill. But the clump of trees on top was unlikely to have been planted when this painting was made. So I think that is me just being a little bit fanciful. But a really, really good image. And the flagon of cider as well. And then down here are coppice stools with another one up there in the background. We'll see those on photographs a bit later on. This is where the trees have been cut down for poles, possibly hop poles like the ones in the previous photograph. This is from David Lovelace's chapter in that Landscape Origins of the Wye Valley. We've got bark ricks, big stacks of bark, and this is Hoffwood in the 19th century. And that's on David's website, which has got a lot about the project that produced the Landscape Origins of the Wye Valley book. And then this is a very interesting trail to follow. I won't take you very far down it, but it's an industry well worth looking into. I even found a video of a tannery in Devon that's still operating traditional methods. One of the things I found out is that it was extremely stinky, and it was impossible to thoroughly wash the smell off yourself if you worked in a tannery, to the extent that census records, apparently, show that houses next to those in which tanners lived were sometimes empty, because nobody wanted to live next to the smell of the poor people who worked there. But this is the Barton Tannery, which must have been somewhere down on Barton Road, although I've not managed to find a named reference to it, although I'm sure David Lovelace or Andy Tatchell would be able to identify the site of the building. They also owned the Tanbrook Tannery, which was on Widemarsh Street, which would have been next to a brook that's now being filled in, but that's another project. So I'll not go down that route. But I like the fact that on this photograph, all of the tools are named. We've got a hide stick, a plunger, a pit hook, a fleshing knife, and also Mrs. Mail here is the bark mill feeder. And that's the bit where the woodland products come in. The bark was ground up into a fine powder called tan bark, and the details of that industry, as I say, are on this rather nice video, which fortunately doesn't have scents around, of this tannery operating in Devon. But this is a group of people working in Hereford, and they would have been using bark from Herefordshire woodlands. And there was money in bark. It was a lot of people were needed, and it was quite an expensive product. This building too, which many people are familiar with, overlooks the car park at Queenswood. That is a tannery that was originally in Leominster and was moved up to the Queenswood site, and now has the shop. And in here, the loos are in here, and there are offices upstairs for the Wildlife Trust. That's the end of the history bit. Any questions?
Yeah, there is. There's one from Sally Webster, which is going back about optimum time. She says, can you say anything about optimum times of the year for coppicing, e.g. in relation to wildlife, specific species, etc.?
Yeah, it's winter. And they're well established. You don't do it when the birds are nesting. So we usually start late November, and we'll aim to be finished by mid-March. We were much earlier than that last year. In fact, I think it was February by the time we finished. And there are various species we need to look out for. Obviously, the dormice might well be nesting. So wherever we're coppicing, whether it's Queenswood or the reserves, we are on the lookout for dormice nesting in the bases of the trees of the coppice stools. And also, if I go back quickly here, at this point, where these two compartments join, we left a dormouse bridge for them when they wake up to continue to migrate across. So yeah, there is an optimum time, and I would say November December, January are the best times from the point of view of disturbing wildlife. Oops, any other questions?
A comment, and excuse me in advance for maybe not getting the name right, N.A. Smith. We still have a woodland being worked for tanning oak bark for a Cornish company.
In Herefordshire?
You have to ask.
On this person's land, I guess. Well, that's good. I mean, there are still tanneries doing it, and as we know from the repair shop, there is still a big demand for specialist leather in a range of products, saddlery in particular. So yeah, oh, that's good if there's somewhere in Herefordshire that's producing bark for that purpose. Thank you. Practicalities. This is kind of how we do it today. It would have involved, there's only at the most 4 of us working at any one time, and a lot of the time there's only 2 of us, and compared to those at least 11 men and 6 horses. The principle is that there have to be rides put in, coppice rides, along which you can drive vehicles, or in the past bring a horse, because all of your materials ultimately end up leaving the site on these rides. And at Queenswood, they are hard surfaced, so it's possible to drive an ordinary road vehicle with road tyres on them. Sometimes some of them are a little bit tricky and need a tractor. But basically the ride is following the contour lines. And you tend to work on the slope above the ride. Sometimes you can work from below the ride up to it, but the optimum is to work from the slope above it down to the ride. And you work in things that are called racks. They'll have other names in other areas, but we've got sort of 1, 2, 3, 4 racks here. Can everyone see the cursor when I move it? I assume that, can you see it, Anne? The cursor moving between?
Yeah, I can see it, yeah.
Good, because we had a problem with that on a Zoom call this morning, but that's fine. Okay, you work from the top of the rack and you cut the tree, you fell the trees and you process them in ways that will be shown later on. And you lay the brash with its heavy, thick end down the slope and the thin, whippety bits at the very top upslope. And you start laying it at the top of the rack where you're cutting. And you gradually fell the trees down the rack, laying the brash to one side of the rack as you go. So the heavy butt end is down slope. That means that when you come to work back up the rack, chipping the brash, you're picking it off the top of the pile and feeding it into the chipper, working up the rack. It's taken a while for us trainees to get this right. It looks fairly simple, but when you're actually in a wood and you're felling trees and doing other things, extracting products and making decisions about length of timber and whatever, you can lose the plot a bit. And I freely admit that we have done that, but I hope that as we enter our 3rd year, we're getting better at it. That's a nice tidy diagram. That's real brash. They have been laid in order. The latest ones to be laid are here at the front, and they would be the first ones to be picked up and processed. But the problem here in this photograph is that it is not clearly arranged in racks. It's just one big mass. But it would at least be possible to work up this slope, which is upslope in this direction towards the top of the photograph, picking the heavy ends up off the top of the debris underneath. The thing that really slows the process down is if it all gets tangled. So what we've got here is what it's really like in the woods. There is an order there, but I've added the diagrams to try and make sense of it. This wedge shape here is the rack, and this arrow here is upslope. This section inside the dashed line has been cleared. These trees here in the bottom left corner are in the rack, but have yet to be felled. Doing it this way means that you do have a clear space into which to fell trees. As you go, you process the trees so that the top thin ends are stacked up for brash, or if they're straight enough, they can be extracted for bean poles. But that does depend on having straight hazel in particular. And this photograph, nearly everything is ash and oak. But the windrow of brash, which is this stuff in this slide, is being built up here, up in this direction, off into the distance. And the 12-foot lengths of bigger timber, ready to be processed into firewood, are being stacked parallel to the rack so that they can later be collected and taken up to the yard for processing. Now, there are more photographs of this. This is the largest tree that I felled this year, which was actually about 50 foot. It's an ash tree, and it's been felled with what is called a Danish pie cut. But the reason it relates to what I was just showing is you can see very clearly here the rack. This is another compartment. Well, actually, it's a partly coppiced compartment, which we may or may not get round to processing this year. But this kind of slight ditchy bit here shows up on the LiDAR and is the boundary of one of the compartments. The compartment lies over on the right, and all of this material here in the top corner is the line of brash, the windrow that's being built up. So I did then process this tree by cutting off the brash, stacking it down here on the bottom right of the photograph on top of this brash, and cutting these bigger bits into 12-foot lengths and placing them parallel to the rack, ready to be collected later on. Here's a rather tidier windrow here. Hopefully you can see the way that this stuff is lying on top of the stuff beneath it going up into the distance. A very clear rack here, and there's even some bean poles that have been separated out here. Whereas that was the 2018-19 winter. This is the 19 to 20 winter. Here we've got lots of 12-foot lengths. And also here, a pile of smaller material, maybe not big enough for firewood, but big enough for charcoal. And that was in fact processed for charcoal later in the year. More about the equipment later on. This illustrates many of the terms I've been using. This is a coppice stool that is yet to be cut here in the background. One stump and many branches coming out of it. Here is a standard tree that has possibly never been coppiced since it started growing. So it's one solid stem there, and that will be left as the coppice is cut around it. Here we've got the brash laid in a windrow here, and then the 12-foot lengths parallel to the windrow. The rack runs up the slope here, and then here is a newly cut coppice stool. Important to cut as close to the ground as possible, because that, well, it's easy to get the tractors in and out of the compartment, but also it's best practice for encouraging nice low growth of the shoots, so you don't get something that is a cross between a coppice and a pollard, which is another matter which I won't go into at this stage. This is the equipment. This is formerly the council, now the Wildlife Trust tractor for use at Queenswood, and this is the chipper on the back of it. And the chipper, unlike the ones you see tree surgeons using around Hereford City, is actually driven from the tractor's power takeoff down here. You can just see a corner of the chipper here. It runs off the power takeoff, and it's lifted up and down to move it from point to point where you're chipping. You always set it down on the ground using the hydraulics to chip it, and then you lift it off the ground and drive forward to another location or backwards. And the other truss tractor is this smaller one, the Valiant. That too has a power takeoff and hydraulics. In the winter of 18 to 19, we used the small trailer, which is a tipping trailer, works off the hydraulics on the small tractor. And the chipper was used to blow the chip into the trailer. The chip is produced by feeding the brash, which you can just see the top of a windrow up here. The brash is fed into this hopper, dragged into the chipper, where a huge flywheel with blades on it turns it into chip that then is collected in the trailer and taken away from the compartment. If you can't do it and you haven't got any peasants needing firewood, faggots, then it either gets left as windrows to keep deer out with varying degrees of success, or it is burnt. But there are limitations to burning it, particularly since it can damage the fungal and tree root networks, and so it's something that is used sparingly, and we don't use it at Queenswood. We chip it, we don't burn it. More chipping going on there. Always have to have the lights on the tractor that's operating the chipper. You can see here debris disappearing inside this hopper and then being thrown out into the trailer there. Some compartments are more difficult than others to work. This is a particularly steep one from the first two that we did after the training. This was last winter, 2019 to 2020. We'd swapped the devices round. This is the trailer on the big tractor. This is the chipper on the little tractor. And it's a bigger trailer. It holds a lot of chip in there. But it does also illustrate that we've got the 12-foot lengths of timber, an uncut coppice compartment in the background there, a standard tree, another standard tree, and chipper's not operating, so the lights are off. And it also illustrates the awkwardness of getting the equipment in among the stumps. You often end up with things at some pretty crazy angles. We prefer to have the chipper to one side of the trailer. It's easy to organise the work that way. But sometimes, like this year, this is only a couple of weeks ago, this photograph, less than that actually, we were working in a very deep, narrow gully. So we really had our work cut out, fitting everything in the right place. This tree is a field maple, which is an unusual one for the compartment. Quite a nice specimen, so that was spared, whereas everything around it has been coppiced. But that was left as a small standard tree. Viewing platform is just off in the background over there. But yeah, as I say, this is very recent. But we did end up with the tractors at some pretty crooked angles in a very confined space. But they'll go there. That's what they're designed to do. This one, you'll notice, is articulated around its waist, so it can really twist and keep moving. This is Paul's photograph of the forwarder, which is his part of the operation. Big tractor, and this here has a grab on it, and it will pick up the 12-foot lengths in the grab here and lift them onto this trailer. The grab works off the hydraulics on the tractor. And this is a very important part of the process, which we cannot carry out on many, if any, of our reserves. But we can do it at Queenswood because the site is big enough, the access is good enough, and the equipment's on site to carry out this very important part of the operation, which means we can sell the firewood up from the yard at Queenswood. This is the setup that brings it from the coppice compartment to the point at which it's sold. Any questions on the practicalities?
Yeah. Richie Cottrell has he's shared a document, a file, which is BG Coppice, which anyway, I don't know what it is, but he can explain. And he also has a question, which is why chip the brash? Why not leave it in the windrow as habitat breaks like we managed here near Kinton?
It's because the chip is needed on site at Queenswood. The muddier paths, the first year we were coppicing, we put it down, and people were grateful for that because it acted as a carpet over the mud. Because there are, unlike other coppice woodlands, there are a lot of visitors. We have to be very rigorous with our safety signs, and also whenever we're felling a tree, we had to really check that people haven't ignored those signs. It is a much visited site, and that's been particularly true during lockdowns 1 and 2. And of course, there's also a lot of dogs. So it acts as a carpet is one reason, and I appreciate that might not be necessary in other sites. We do actually use it as windbreaks in a lot of the truss reserves. And I also know one commercial operation making charcoal where they stack the brash around the coppice stools as a traditional method of keeping the deer from browsing the coppice stools. So chipping is not the only option, but it is the one we use at Queenswood. And doubtless Paul Ratcliffe would be able to provide more detail on any other reasons I've missed as to why we chip it at Queenswood. Any other questions?
Well, there's another comment from Richie Cottrell. He says they have peasants. They are peasants who volunteer some work for a bit of firewood. Not sure if that arrangement exists at Queenswood.
I think people avail themselves of the wood that's left as a result of the coppicing on the reserves. I think that's definitely true on the Doward, where we have quite a few reserves. So yes, we leave it on the assumption that people will take it. In fact, we often put it close to gates and paths. Queenswood, some of the brash is taken and paid for by the Hampton Court estate, who use it for their vegetable beds for some of the crops to grow up. So they actually come in and take quite a bit each year. They're particularly interested in birch. So the compartment we're working at the moment won't provide much for them, but previous 2 years it has, and they have been in with a pickup truck and have bought it. Forest of Dean, you can get a brushwood license, which means you can take any brushwood from the forest. I don't think such a thing exists at Queenswood. Once again, Paul would be the person to talk to about visitors helping themselves to small wood.
There's another question from Sally Webster, which is, are there any species of trees that do not respond well to coppicing?
They respond to different degrees. Whether there will be some that don't respond as well. I would need to consult some reference books on that. I'd go first of all to Oliver Rackham, Woodland, Connor's New Naturalist series. I know that beech responds differently, so you do have to coppice in different ways. We are told that we can cut older higher because of the way the suckers come out from the stump. But I think most species do respond to it. Also, of course, there's the whole issue of species in hedges and how they respond to pleaching, which is a similar process to coppicing, in that you cut the tree, but you don't kill it by cutting right through. And there are many hedgerow species that do respond to coppicing. So I'm not aware immediately of any of those so-called native British hardwoods that don't respond at all, but that varying degrees, I would say. But I would be very willing to avert to an expert on that. Yeah, but it does differ how well they coppice. Hazel is particularly good. Birch is particularly good. But oak seems to cope pretty well too. We've got some good oak coppice stools. But hazel is the classic.
This is a question about the cut from John Cook. Should the stools be cut horizontally or at an angle to allow the water to drain?
I've been taught by various people over the years, going right back 9 years now from when I started, to slope them so the water runs off. You don't really want to create a bowl in which water builds up, because that might encourage rotting of weaker bits of the timber. So yes, I always try and cut them at a slope.
And just to go back to the deer questions from Sally Webster, how much of an issue is there with deer at Queenswood?
There's quite a big issue. We've got evidence that they don't seem so keen on birch, which can mean that you cut a compartment and the birch comes back as the dominant, whereas it wasn't originally. However, there are a lot of visitors, so they're not able to browse as much as they would be in some very remote areas on some trust reserves where we have to put up deer fencing. But they are definitely in there at Queenswood browsing, yeah.
And from Jim Hardy, have you thought about using horses to take brash and timber to forward or to avoid ground damage?
There was, I think it was maybe part of Ruth's project or maybe another event. There's definitely been somebody working, I think within the past year, at Queenswood with horses. There are people in Herefordshire that do that. Completely transplanting tractors with horses, I don't think we're at that point, but it would have been done traditionally, as the photographs show. And once again, if there's a long-term future in using horses, that would be a matter for Paul as the reserves officer. I would say that we're trying to limit the amount of time we spend driving up and down the racks. The tractors do have very broad tyres. The wheels don't slip. So the damage done, particularly since there's often a layer of very small brash, is fairly limited by the tractors. But it's an interesting point, and certainly it is the traditional way of doing things. And of course, you've got no fuel consumption, well, other than the horse's food. Anything else?
Regarding the chipping, Paul said the chip is used in the online on-site play area, and it's also sold. And Graham Soul says chipping's much appreciated. Thank you. And then, hang on a second, Sally is making a. She asks, and where am I? I've lost myself. Sally, and I don't know what this is in reference to. I've lost it. Possibly very mature hawthorn in hedgerows. Sally might need to elaborate on that. I think it's a response.
Oh yeah, I know what she's meaning, because I've been there. Yeah, you would struggle to pleach and feed a hawthorn into a hedge. and they are often left, and we have left them in hedging activities. And the other thing worth mentioning at that point is that hollies are left in a lot of counties, partly because of superstition. And I have to say, I don't like cutting a holly unless it really is in the way of a fence or something. They're often left in hedgerows. And one theory is that the evil spirits run along the hedgerow tops. And if you want to stop them getting to your farm, then you leave the hollies in the hedge, and they can't get past them. And I have seen a hedgerow in Devon where the contractor had very carefully lifted the flail every time he or she got to a holly. So you've got the hollies sticking up out of this otherwise flat-topped hedge. And yeah, hawthorns, I think, might well occupy a similar position, partly because of practicality as well. They're tough trees to pleach.
Additional comment about holly is that it's a winter, from Liz Overstall, it's winter fodder for sheep. It has lots of minerals.
Yep.
One last question. Is it fallow, roe, or muntjac deer that cause the most issues?
Oof. I've not seen him. Paul probably has. I've seen pheasants from the neighbouring estates. I think I might even have seen a woodcock the other day, but I've not seen the deer, so I'm not sure which species it is. But if Paul's there, he might be able to confirm whether it's fallow or muntjac, or possibly both.
Fallow at Queenswood, he says.
Right. Okay.
And then Jim Hardy adds about holly. It was traditionally kept for feeding green stuff in winter. Only the upper leaves are prickle-free. Right,
yeah, okay. So you might cut those off, but not cut the whole tree in a hedge. Right.
That's it so far.
Okay, move on. The products and how to buy them. Beam poles. I think there are still some at Queenswood. We're not going to get, well, Kevin and I are not going to get very many this year because the trees have very few hazel, and what there is of oak and ash is also pretty twisted. However, I believe there is the possibility of a coppice worker coming into work a compartment that does have some straight hazel, so they might be available. They're bundled up in 11s, so you have 5 each side of your sort of gable of poles, and then one along the top to tie them in. And how long are they? I can't remember. But we were the specification we were cutting them to 8 foot, I think. Yeah, there they are. This was the first year we were doing it, and this was after having been trained by the coppice worker. But yeah, there may be more on the way of those. And they are, of course, very good for growing your beams up, and they do last, particularly if you're able to store them indoors when you're not using them. But you can see the brash from which they were cut there in the background. These knobbly bits are knocked off with a bill hook, good sharp bill hook. Hedging stakes, regularly needed by the trust. We once again, I've not got very many straight ones, but when we're out on the reserves, we were at Briddy Green Dingle recently, and we were laying aside hedging stakes from ash trees that were being felled. And they're an important part of the hedging process, and the Trust is actively involved in hedging on many of its reserves. And hopefully, post-COVID crisis, we may be able to get back to even running hedging courses. So a lot of these are needed as a key component of hedging. We also in the first year managed to produce some pea sticks, which weren't terribly popular. We didn't have very many of them either, but they are another product from the tops of the hazel. And then the wood chip is in demand for the play area. It needs regularly resurfacing. We do have to make sure it's thorn free, The last load I tipped there a fortnight ago, I knew it was thorn free because I had not felled any thorns. And then we chipped the whole windrow. And so it was all oak and ash. But you don't want thorns in the kids' playground. But that whole trailer load is needed in the playground, and it will take 2 or 3 trailer loads to safely carpet the playground, and that's a regular job, as well as laying it on the paths around the site, reasons I've explained. And also it is available for sale. You know, people use it for their paths and their allotments or for beds in developments all over the county. Charcoal. Now, trust aficionados will recognise a few faces here. I can see Andrew Nixon. I think this is Amanda. There's James. Having a work day loading the charcoal kiln, which was positioned at the top end of one of the compartments we cut in the first year. Very interesting process, positioning it, digging its flues. These are flues here which will vent the burning process from beneath. It's a big drum. You can get the size of it there from the people. There's the lid. Very carefully stacked small lengths of timber from the smaller stuff we'd left around the site that wasn't going as 12-foot lengths for firewood. And then it's lit, and it has, when it's in full swing, I think it's actually got 6 chimneys. It's basically partly burned. It doesn't completely burn to ash, which would be useless as fuel. Talking of which, my fire's starting to go out. Then, I think this is the hands of Lewis there, looks like it. Processing it from the kiln through a bucket with no bottom into the bags, which were sold in the shop. A recent conversation with Lewis by the kiln, or in relation to the kiln, suggested that it would no longer be produced at Queenswood. So that was the decision, the most recent one that I know. But this is a woodland product, and I do not know for certain whether the kiln is going to be retained by the trust or whether it will be sold. And the trust will no longer therefore be able to produce its own charcoal. But certainly this has been available at Queenswood, pending decisions to be finalised. It may or may not be available this summer, but it is very good stuff. And in fact, as an aside, my friend who operates Birchwood, which is a wood near Solascope, has gone for a international market of very high quality charcoal, produced in massive kilns, much bigger than that. And he's selling to kitchens all over the UK. Because the charcoal is such good quality, it doesn't need accelerant, and so it doesn't taint the food at all. And top chefs are really on the lookout for that. These are the 12-foot lengths arriving at Queenswood yard. These are from early 2019, and they were laying in the yard until late 2020, October 2020. So they've been around for what, 18 months or so, having been cut into 12-foot lengths, brought up by the forwarder that I showed you earlier. The trust doesn't have this equipment, and so they bring in a contractor, say with wood. 2 very, very hard-working young guys, Connor and Ben, worked on processing this lot using this device, which is seen in action on the next slide. Here we go. It splits the wood, first of all, and then, it cuts it into short lengths, then splits it. Occasionally you can see 2 split pieces coming off the top there. 2 just came off the top into the trailer. So this is a contractor coming in to process the wood. Obviously they have to be paid, whereas Kevin and I are doing the coppicing, and Paul Lifton are volunteers, which helps increase the profit on the firewood, but there are still costs incurred. You know, a firewood operation is difficult to make profitable. Having volunteers does make it more viable. I think this video may start again unless I press twice. There we go. The firewood is stored in these rather nifty boxes, which are rather like the potato boxes you see on farms, but they're slatted so the air moves through them. These are stacked 3 high, and in that previous video, the two guys were filling these boxes, which are then stacked, and that helps to air dry the firewood. Ideally, there would be tarpaulins over the top of each pile of filled boxes, crates. A lot of the wood has been stacked. Rod and I have done a lot of this, and other volunteers. This year I filled about half of it. It holds many cubic meters in there, in the barn, in the yard. And there is another barn as well, a lean-to that's called. But this is where the punters drive in and load up their vehicle. A small bag is £4.50. A boot bag, which is 1/10 of a cubic metre, I've calculated, is available for £3, and the wood that goes in it is £12. So if you bring your boot bag back for a refill, it'll cost 12 quid. Small car, 28, large boot, 45, estate car boot, 58, and then a cubic metre is 90 quid, which is favourable compared to some of the other providers. We don't deliver, but the location is a major advantage. Right next to the A49, very obvious place. You pay for your wood in the shop and then you drive into the yard to load up. Occasionally there are sale days in which the price is less, and also there are volunteers on hand to help people load their cars. They have been very popular. I should say that this year the forwarding and processing of the firewood was upset by COVID in various ways, which I won't go into. But like many production processes, COVID-19 did produce an effect on our firewood. But we do have firewood for sale at Queenswood. Any questions on production?
Nope.
No? Okay, I'll move on quickly to the Heritage Gateway project because it's 25 past and I'm aiming to finish by 1/2 past. 2017 to 2019, it was aiming to explore and showcase the heritage of this Queenswood site. And it got grants up to £100,000 from the Heritage Lottery Fund, European Agricultural Fund. Number of strands to it. One of them was this, which many visitors to Queenswood will have seen, these wind-up sound modules in these big oak, they're not oak, but they're big wood monoliths. It's an audio-visual trail, runs through the Arboretum, and there's excerpts of oral history and poems and birdsong, and also links to the trees in the Arboretum and the natural history of the woodland. That's sort of setting off from and returning to the car park. There's also the Commemorative Woodland, which was clearing a circle of trees and leaving one stump in the middle. Say It With Wood provided the chestnut fencing. And that was a very satisfying job working with them and Ruth to install this circle of palings. Very attractive, the simple method of having one long and one short, one long, one short, one long paling, all held together by wire. And it's got interpretation panels within it, which and around it, which explains some of the history of the site, including the role of women working the woodland in the First World War. If you haven't been to explore it, it's well worth it. You go up the main avenue from the car park and it's off on your left. And a local artist, Des Hughes, was picked to create the Memorial Woodland art piece, which is in the centre there. There's the booklet I referred to earlier. That was one of the products of the project. And there was also engagement with local schools, 5 of them. And young people and volunteers were trained in oral history skills. And events were held for children, and which of course they still are at Queenswood, but these were specific to the Heritage Gateway project. And then there are many signs and interpretation boards that have been put up around the site, making it more welcoming and accessible. That project has now finished, but the things that were produced from it are still there. And I do recommend this book if anyone's interested in more on the background. This is a nice photo here of the what's now the Jubilee Room, which was the cafe at the top of Dinmore Hill for many years. And there's a separate bit in the book about that. Now that pretty much finishes the Coppicing at Queenswood talk. There is one more thing I'll go on to, but are there any questions about the Heritage Gateway project?
Oh, no.
I wanted to quickly mention, Mo Burns in particular has asked me to mention this, because we are coming up to Tree Week. And I and the Hereford City Tree Wardens have produced a city tree trail for anyone who's interested in, lives in Hereford and just wants to get out and see some trees on their doorstep. There is an app which is free to download. It was called Sprytar. It's now got a much better name, Love Exploring. And that's quite simply the address to go to, loveexploring, all one chain, .co.uk. But once you've loaded the app on your phone, if your phone is locating itself, when you get to a particular city site and you open the app, then you get trails to follow. And the ones in Hereford City include a tree trail. Now, I don't know whether there is a tree trail on this app at Queenswood, but it might be worth thinking about that. And I'd be willing to do it, Paul, if there was a decision that it was worth doing. What I don't know is how much use is being made of this app in Hereford and across the country. Although across the country, they do say here it's been downloaded nearly 50,000 times, 35,000 active accounts. So that is a mention leading into Tree Week. And I can stay around for a few minutes more if anyone wants to ask any further questions, but I'll wind up what I say at pretty much exactly 8:30. Thank you all for listening patiently.
Nic, can I say a word?
Hi, Brian.
Hello, Nic. For those that don't know me, I'm Brian Howell. I'm chair of the Board of Trustees. I just wanted to say a thank you on behalf of HWT to Nic and to all his assistants at the City branch for a very entertaining, very comprehensive, very informative evening. It was very enjoyable. And I think we ought to place on record our thanks to you and all your helpers for what you've done tonight and the other ones that you do and you're going to do in the future. So on behalf of the Trust as a whole, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Brian. We got anything coming up on the chat, Anne?
Yeah, somebody has, oh, it's from Graham. Graham Soul, he says, many thanks. I echo that. So it's thank yous at the moment.
I'll open the chat so I can see it.
Yeah. Why don't you do that?
So, as Frances has already explained, it will be possible to get the recording from her, yeah, I think if no one's got any further questions on that, then we can probably wind it up and people can leave the meeting. But City Branch has got other events coming up, and they will be on the Trust website under the events tab.
You do have another question.
Right.
Is from Jim Hardy, which he can probably ask himself.
I'm just fascinated to know that you check for dormice, because I know they hibernate at ground level, don't they?
Yeah.
How do you check that you're not going to disturb them without disturbing them, is my question.
Yes, it's a theoretical issue. I mean, it has to be a pretty cursory. You might well not uncover them until you've felled a couple of poles from that coppice stool, which might be too late. But then again, if you did spot something, you would stop and hope that you hadn't disturbed them, rather than destroying the whole of their home. I mean, partly it does depend on evidence in advance that they are on that particular site. So Briddy Green Dingle is one where we know they're there. So we are extra careful there when we're doing coppice stools.
I'm doing some coppicing on Walterstone Common at the moment, and we've definitely got dormice there. So it's it's something I was concerned about. But I guess if you don't actually chop them in half, they just go back to sleep. If you leave them.
Yeah. I mean, apparently the nests are kind of small ball-like structures. I've not seen one. Lewis has described them to me, but it is something that when we're working on any site, the reserves officer would tell us about. But I think until you've actually seen one yourself, it's a little difficult to know exactly what you're looking for if you're the one with the chainsaw.
Right, thank you.
Anybody else? Brian? Brian's saying bye-bye. Okay. I think we'll wind it up now, Anne. Yeah? So
Right.
I'll end this, but if there are any questions or anything that comes up, then by all means contact the Trust, either through Francis or just info at herefordshirewt.co.uk, and they can forward any queries to me. But yeah, thank you all for coming. Do we have an idea how many people there were altogether, Anne?
Yeah, I think at one point there were 40. And yeah, so it was between 38 and 40, I think, as people went and got their,
yeah,
their grub and stuff. Yes. So yeah.
Hour and a half's a long time.
Well, 40 screens, so that could be.
Yeah, more people if there's two on each one. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna wind it up now. So goodbye, everybody, and thank you very much for attending. From Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, goodbye and thank you.